Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. Food Banks Canada says there were around 1.5 million visits to food banks in March, and Alberta led the way with the most visits. Testimonies continued at the public inquiry into the Emergencies Act in Ottawa. We hear from a lawyer with the Justice Centre who's there representing protesters. And the 2022 Poppy campaign is about to launch. Video journalist Micah Quinn explains how it truly honors so many of our veterans.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. The family of Tia Blood has released a statement following the devastating news from Alberta RCMP after the coroner's office confirmed it was Tia's body that was found in Lethbridge County earlier this week. Tia was first reported missing on October the 21st. In a statement, the family said the news has devastated our large and loving family. Tia was our shining light, and words cannot describe how much she will be missed. She was a loving wife, a mother of two wonderful boys, daughter, sister, niece, cousin, and a friend to so many. A gentle woman, she liked her sweets and liked to bake. Tia took care of her health and was prayerful. Please be mindful that our family is grieving. Any speculation about the circumstances surrounding her death are especially hurtful to our family. Please don't take part in spreading rumors about our beloved Tia. The investigation into Tia's death continues, which police say occurred between October 19th and 20th. Police are asking if you have any information that can help them with their case to call Crime Stoppers right away at 1-800-222-8477. Albertans are facing some real tough times right now. With inflation and the cost of living continuing to rise, it can mean families are unable to pay for their groceries. A new hunger count report was released by Food Banks Canada. It says there were 1.5 million visits to food banks last March. That was a 15% jump from the same month last year and 35% higher than in March of 2019. As for Albertans, we accessed food banks more than double the national rate compared to pre-pandemic levels. Just under 157,000 Albertans accessed a food bank in March of this year. That's a 34% increase compared to 2021. Ariana Scott, the CEO of Food Banks Alberta, says close to 58,000 children use food banks annually, and around 45% of Albertans that use food banks are families. She says times have been tough for a number of Albertans.
When all of our citizens struggle, it trickles down, and so it impacts our children, whether it's a senior who's experiencing food insecurity or a middle-aged person. It's impacting the children in our province, and as that trickle-down effect happens, so if a senior is experiencing it, their children may take them in, which puts their family at a greater food insecure position. It's not an isolated to rural or urban situation. It is across the province. It is the whole province. And therefore, we have to look at it from a provincial perspective and treat it as such.
The report also says that 1 in 5 Albertans, or 20%, are experiencing food insecurity. And close to 60% of rural food bank users receive government assistance like AISH or the Canada Pension Plan. You know, the high cost of living is impacting so many Canadians. Now, here in southwestern Alberta, some people are even living in their vehicles right now. That's according to Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas.
You know, I've had numerous people come into my office with their home heating bills, and they'll often circle the carbon tax line so that I can see directly what it equates to for them, and they're just totally distraught. And for good reason. Again, you know, the Trudeau Liberals have determined that they are going to triple the carbon tax. Well, at the end of the day, we know people need to heat their homes. This is Canada. And so putting a carbon tax on that is just punitive in nature. It's not actually going to help curb behavior.
Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas will also discuss how the increase in carbon tax is affecting our farmers. She'll have details coming up after business news. The final crop report for the 2022 Alberta growing season is in, and it brought some pretty good news. This growing season indicated much higher yields, or about 10% above the 5-year average. The report says quality for hard red spring wheat, canola and dry peas was above their 5-year averages. Meanwhile, oats and durum wheat were lower. Quality for malt and feed barley was on par with the 5-year average. Due to favorable conditions, farmers across Alberta were 2 to 3 weeks ahead in harvest progress for the second straight year. As of October the 11th, 99% of all crops have been harvested here in Alberta. Our province also passed a very grim milestone recently. As of Wednesday, 5,011 Albertans have now died from COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic. The province reported that 28 more Albertans died since Alberta's last COVID-19 update a week ago. There are currently 1,118 Albertans in hospital with COVID, including 28 in the ICU. Fortunately, hundreds of thousands of Albertans have also recovered from the virus. Dr. Chris Modi, head of the microbiology department at the University of Calgary, says there's no indication of an imminent rise in COVID-19 cases. He does say, however, that may change as the weather turns colder. Stephen Lewis is a Canadian health policy and research consultant. He says when it comes to Alberta health care, there are some fundamental problems that need to be addressed. A big one is miscommunication between certain levels of government.
We've never really had the kind of unified approach between medical associations and governments about how are we going to fix these things together? What do we agree that we all ought to do together? I think Alberta, one of Alberta's historical problems in a way has been that it's been so rich. I mean, in all those years where Alberta had enormous resources, it built a lot of infrastructure. And again, it was easier to add more money and to buy more equipment and open up another fancy 75-bed hospital in a smaller center than to actually get down to the work of saying, look, let's try to get the waste out of the system. Let's really focus on primary care.
Make sure you catch the full interview with health policy and research consultant Stephen Lewis and BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up in the second half of our program. Well, we had a wind warning in Lethbridge today. The Windy City has been living up to its nickname. Speaking of Jeanette, she's in now with an early peek at the forecast. Jeanette, we've seen wind gusts in some regions of southwestern Alberta up to 100 kilometers an hour. I mean, Category 1 hurricane winds started at 120 k.
Yeah, that's true, Hal. And there's a reason why our local hockey team is called the Hurricanes too. And I wish that I could tell you that those winds are going to die down overnight, but we are looking at gusts of 70 to 100 kilometers per hour remaining overnight before dying down to about 60 k, which is where they will remain tomorrow, up to 60 kilometer per hour wind gusts on Friday, but a high of 13. So that is the good news, and partly cloudy skies clearing off to give us a fairly sunny day on Friday. As for the rest of the weekend, which is coming up very shortly, I'll have all those details coming up for you later on in the show.
Thanks so much, Jeanette. The public inquiry into the Emergencies Act continues in Ottawa. More than 65 witnesses will be offering their testimonies over the next 5 weeks of what they saw and experienced during the Freedom Convoy last February. Eva Chepiuk is a lawyer with the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms. She's at the inquiry representing the Freedom Convoy protesters and joins us now from our nation's capital. Eva, a number of Ottawa police officials have been questioned so far during the inquiry. What did you see and hear today?
Well, you know, today is the superintendent of the OPP, so the Ontario Police Force. And we're getting lots of really interesting information, still on the same theme about lack of planning from the Ottawa Police Service. That's the theme we've heard for the last week. So you could really see a difference in policing and action on how Ottawa Police Services responded versus how the OPP would have responded.
Now, critics of the Trudeau Liberals say the Emergencies Act should never have been invoked, but others say due to the perceived incompetence of certain city officials, it was necessary. How do you see it?
What we've heard, as well as I can't name one witness thus far that said that the Emergencies Act was required. So I do think the feds are in a very difficult position to be able to justify the use of the Emergencies Act when everybody, to my knowledge, that has presented evidence to date has said that there was a law in Canada sufficient enough to deal with the protest in Ottawa.
Great. Thanks so much, Eva. Eva Chepiuk is a lawyer with the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, representing the protesters for the Freedom Convoy, and she joined us from the public inquiry into the Emergencies Act taking place in Ottawa. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation testified at the House of Commons Finance Committee. The group was there to outline a plan to balance the federal budget by 2023-2024. Now, to discuss this in more detail is the federal director of the CTF, Franco Terrazzano, who joins us from Ottawa. So, Franco, with all of the spending going on with the Trudeau Liberals, how will it be possible to have a balanced budget so soon?
Well, we crunched the numbers, and our numbers show that the federal government could balance the budget if it was willing to undertake some modest spending restraint. In fact, all it would take to balance the budget would just be to bring spending back to the pre-pandemic levels of 2018-19, which, by the way, were all-time highs, which means that the government was spending more in 2018 than the government did during any single year during World War II. So the government could balance the budget with modest spending restraint, and that would mean no more wasting money on things like $8,800 for a sex toy show in Germany, or no more giving former governors general a $200,000 expense account for life, and no more giving 300,000 bureaucrats a raise while their neighbors lose their job or business during a pandemic, and no more announcing hundreds of millions of dollars for companies like Bombardier.
Now, Franco, a recent Ipsos poll says that 72% of Canadians say they pay way too much tax. You say you found 51 other national governments that provided tax relief during the pandemic and to help ease the burdens of inflation?
Canadians are paying too much tax because the government is wasting too much money. And we've seen during the pandemic, the government continue to raise taxes. The feds raise gas taxes, the feds raise alcohol taxes, and the government raise payroll taxes. And while Ottawa has been sticking Canadians with higher tax bills, 51 other national governments did the right thing and cut taxes during the pandemic or to ease the pain of inflation. Australia, for example, cut its gas tax in half. You had the United Kingdom also announcing gas tax relief. So did Germany. South Korea cut taxes at the pump by about 30%. And India specifically cut gas taxes to help the lower and middle income taxpayers deal with higher inflation. So other countries are doing the right thing. Ottawa is sticking us with higher taxes.
Thanks so much, Franco. That was Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, joining us from Ottawa. Lest we forget, Remembrance Day is just around the corner. That means it's time to break out the red poppies. The Lethbridge Royal Canadian Legion announced the official start of the 2022 Poppy campaign, which is set to begin Friday morning. The poppies will be distributed out to business owners during that time. Video journalist Micah Quinn has the story on the important initiative that honors veterans who made the ultimate sacrifice fighting for the freedoms we enjoy today.
People will remember the veterans and support the veterans and keep our country free.
That's what Mary Ansley hopes people will take out of the Poppy campaign leading up to Remembrance Day on November 11th. She works as the membership secretary for the Ladies Auxiliary with the Royal Canadian Legion in Lethbridge. She volunteers her time and distributes out Poppy boxes to schools and businesses here in our city. Her first husband was a veteran that volunteered during the Second World War, and she says it's vital to make sure veterans are remembered.
I even remember some of the First World War veterans, not too many, and then the Second World War veterans. There isn't too many of those left.
The goal for this year's Poppy campaign is to raise $90,000. You can also donate electronically or view a video on your phone using the QR codes on the Poppy boxes. Glenn Miller, the co-chair of public relations for the Royal Canadian Legion in Lethbridge, says the funds for the Poppy campaign will go straight to veterans.
But they go out to help the veterans in need and their families. They also go out to help with equipment to look after veterans and some of the long-term care. We just purchased an exercise bike for the veterans. It also helps out with memorials and monuments. We can also transfer some of our money to our provincial command if there's a need.
A Remembrance Day service will also be held at the Lethbridge and District Exhibition in the South Pavilion starting at 10:30 a.m. on November 11th. Parents of Private Mark Anthony Graham will also be in attendance during the ceremony. Graham was a Canadian Olympic athlete who represented our country in the 1992 Summer Olympics and was also a soldier for the Canadian Armed Forces. He passed away tragically on September 4th of 2006 in Kandahar, Afghanistan.
The lingering effects of the sacrifice is still quite visible in our community as well.
The Lethbridge Cenotaph service will start at 10:40 a.m. this year on Remembrance Day, which will be conducted by the local 20th Independent Field Battery. There will also be a flyby from a transport plane from the City of Lethbridge 429 Squadron. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
With winter just around the corner, the City of Lethbridge is implementing Phase 1 of their snow and ice control changes. With the council's support and after receiving feedback from the community, the city says changes will be taking place with various snow routes this year. The Transportation Operations Manager with the City of Lethbridge explains what some of those changes may look like.
We'll increase plowing along designated areas, approximately 25 kilometers. And starting today, we'll inform residents that live around those snow routes with postcard drop-offs. And we will also have some snow routes that are not affected by this new change. And those people will get letters dropped off at their houses. We have some areas in the north, south, and west. The best is probably for everybody to look online, where we have some maps available. We also have a digital mapping tool where you can type in your address and find out if you're impacted or not.
City officials say parking restrictions will also be in effect in some areas during those heavy snowy days. Scott Gillingham made the leap from city councillor to the mayor of Winnipeg on Wednesday night. He beat out 10 other candidates in a race that went down to the wire. Gillingham came from behind both in opinion polls and in early election night results. He beat second place Glenn Murray by just over 4,000 votes. He replaces Brian Bowman, who served 2 terms as mayor and did not seek re-election. Gillingham ran on a campaign that included hiking property taxes, which he said would fund road repair, provide housing for the homeless, and improve frontline services. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe has his eyes set on defending his province's natural resources. Moe says he's willing to challenge Ottawa on its environmental policies. He says the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling on the carbon tax does not set a precedent.
You know, we have our Canadian Constitution, but we've always felt that the provinces have the ability to develop their natural resources. We see the federal government is using environmental policy to restrict, in many cases, what we are doing in producing some of the most sustainable potash, oil, you name it, here for our global partners around the world. That was held up by the Supreme Court in the case of carbon taxation, but we don't believe that in any way sets a precedent for all of the other 9 policies, plus the Impact Assessment Act that the federal government continues to move forward on. The weighing in on the carbon tax policy doesn't preempt that that's going to work on all of these other 9 policies. So the cap on fertilizer, for example, is outside of the bounds of the federal government's jurisdiction. The cap on oil production outside of the bounds of the federal government's jurisdiction.
Well, here in southwestern Alberta, we had a wind warning in our city. Wind gusts up to 100 kilometers an hour. How long will the brisk autumn winds continue? We'll have details for you in just a moment. We had some very strong winds in the Windy City yet again. Hopefully they won't be around too much longer, maybe a few more days. Jeanette Roche is in now with all of the weather details. Jeanette, it appears as though the gusty winds up to 100 kilometers an hour blew away the rain clouds.
Yeah, it's true. The sun did finally peek out there, Hal. And the good news is it's going to remain over the next several days into Friday, looking at a high of 13 degrees, 60 kilometer per hour winds, of course, as we mentioned before. Saturday, Sunday, 13 as well, and very clear skies into Monday, of course, Halloween, 13 the high, sunny skies. And so as the kids head out to trick-or-treat, they probably won't have to wear a snowsuit this year, so that is definitely the good news. Into Tuesday, though, different story, 4 degrees only the high, and Wednesday, a high of -1 and looking at the chance of some snow. Okay, so the average high for this time of year is 11 degrees, so we're going to be definitely above that over the next few days. -2 is the average low, 25, that was our high temperature on this day back in 1944, and in 1939, it was a chilly -19. 8:12 is when the sun rose this morning, sunset this evening at 6:19 p.m., giving us 10 hours and 7 minutes of daylight. As we look to the west coast, a little bit of a rainy one, 40% chance of showers in both Victoria and Vancouver tomorrow. Victoria sitting at a high of 13 tomorrow, 11 degrees is where Vancouver is going to be looking. 12 degrees in Edmonton tomorrow with a mix of sun and cloud, and Calgary sitting at mainly sunny skies tomorrow, 10 degrees the high with a 20 to 40 kilometer per hour wind. Now, as we look to the rest of the prairies, mainly clear skies all around, 12 degrees the high in Saskatoon, 7 in Regina, 12 also in Winnipeg. Winnipeg looking at a bit of gusty winds, 30 to 50 kilometers per hour. As we look to central Canada, now here's where we're seeing some interesting things. We've got a frost advisory in effect in Toronto with frost patches, but later in the day also a UV index. So 12 degrees the high there. Ottawa seeing a wind chill warning in effect in the morning, but by the afternoon 11 degrees and a UV index there as well. 9 degrees the high in Montreal with mainly clear skies. Clear skies also expected mostly on the Atlantic coast here. 9 degrees the high in Fredericton, 10 in Halifax, 9 also expected in Charlottetown, and a 40% chance of drizzle or showers in St. John's, Newfoundland with a high of 14 degrees. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
Are you tired of high energy bills? Today's weather report is brought to you by Ridge Utilities, providing competitive rates for electricity, natural gas, and internet while investing back in communities across southern Alberta.
Canada's airline industry is warning of disruptions during the upcoming Christmas travel season as labor shortages continue. New job vacancy numbers from Stats Canada show the country's tight labor market continued in August. Transport industry representatives say their problems in retaining certain workers, such as pilots and air traffic controllers, have continued even during and past the pandemic. Officials for the Airline Pilots Association of Canada say airlines are not doing enough to retain pilots because they've resisted paying them more money. A new survey says small business confidence took a nosedive this month. Retail businesses are the least optimistic heading into the very busy Christmas shopping season. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business says its 3-month barometer index dropped 3 points this month to 46.4. That's the lowest since early in the pandemic. It says a third of Canadian small business owners say rising interest rates are causing difficulties. That is up about a fifth at the start of the year. The CFIB says the negative outlook in the retail sector is concerning and shows the anxiety business owners are feeling about inflation and lower consumer spending intentions. Shopify's share price surged close to 17% after it reported its third quarter revenue jumped 22% from a year earlier to nearly $1.37 billion. Despite the increase, the e-commerce software company reported a loss of $158.4 million US in its latest quarter. That compares with a net profit of close to $1.15 billion a year ago after it saw a sharp decline in net gains from equity and other investments. Shopify President Harley Finkelstein says the company is focused on bringing down operating expenses that will get back to profitability. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 72 points on the day to finish at 19,352. The Dow was up 194 points to 32,033. The S&P 500 was down 23 on the day to 3807, and the Nasdaq was down 178 points to 10,792. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up 64 cents to 88.55 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 42 cents to 5.19 US. Gold was down 6 cents to 1663.26 US an ounce, and silver was unchanged at 1960 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $12.65 per bushel, barley's at $9.90, canola's at $19.69, and corn is at $12.09 per bushel. Live cattle were down 5 cents to $151.40. Feeder cattle were down 45 cents to $175.98, and lean hogs December contract was down $3.38 to $84.95. The Canadian dollar was even over the past 24 hours at 73.72 US. Recapping one of our top stories, Albertans have been facing some pretty tough times right now. With inflation and the high cost of living, it can mean a lot of families are unable to pay for groceries. A new hunger count report was released by Food Banks Canada. It says there were 1.5 million visits to food banks last March. That was a 15% jump from the same month last year and a 35% higher jump than in March of 2019. As for Albertans, we accessed food banks more than double the national rate compared to pre-pandemic levels. Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas has been blasting the Trudeau Liberals over the high cost of living right now. She says it's an issue generated by Ottawa and will explain why shortly. Listen, if you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. We'd love to hear from you. The annual rate of inflation is just below 7%, which is the highest level in 4 decades. Are the Trudeau Liberals to blame, or is it just factors outside of Canada influencing the higher cost of food, fuel, and heating our homes? Lethbridge MP and the Shadow Minister for Canadian Heritage, Rachel Thomas, has her thoughts, and she joins us now from the nation's capital. Rachel, welcome back to Bridge City News.
Thank you, Hal. It's really nice to be here with you.
Yeah, you too. Now, the cost of food has gone up by more than 11% over the past year. Some restaurants here in Lethbridge closed their doors, as you're well aware, including Mocha Cabana and Sam's Donaires and Hamburgers. When we chatted with the owners, they said, you know what, we just can't keep up anymore with the high cost of food. Is the federal government to blame for this?
Yeah, I think that there's a few complexities involved, but certainly the federal government has part of the blame to bear. And, I would say particularly with regards to taxation and inflation, which seem to be the two largest measures at play here. So with regards to taxation, we're watching as the Liberals are increasing the carbon tax, we're watching as they're increasing payroll taxes. I'm hearing from local businesses within our community and across Canada that this is having a dramatic impact on their ability to, make a go of it. But also inflation. So we know that as inflation, goes up, businesses are trying to run with narrow margins as it is in terms of what their expenditures are and what their revenue is. And so at the end of the day, I'm hearing from many local businesses that are just having a hard time making a go of it, especially in the food industry when you're watching prices go up by, somewhere along the lines of 11 to 12%. Well, that's significant. And then you try to pass that on to the customer, and the customer already feels squeezed. And so then they just stop eating out. And so because Canadians are finding it more difficult to make ends meet, they go out to restaurants less frequently, and as a result, then of course, we're unfortunately facing some of these shutdowns.
Now, a number of farmers who provide a lot of the food that we enjoy dry their grain with natural gas and are also concerned about the increase in the carbon tax by the Trudeau Liberals. What are you hearing from our producers here in southwestern Alberta?
Yeah, and it's certainly all of this is tied in, right? It all has to do with government policy and taxation and affordability. So with regard to farmers, I mean, let's just take a moment and celebrate just the incredible nature of these folks. These are the women and men who are working remarkably hard to feed not only Canadians, but to feed the world. I wish our government acknowledged that. I wish that was celebrated instead of punished. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So instead, we have a government that's looking to increase the carbon tax. In fact, it's going to triple by 2030. In addition to that, the government is saying that they want to see reductions by 30% to the use of fertilizer, which is going to have a dramatically harmful impact on farmers and their ability to be able to produce food, again, food that feeds Canada and the world. And so, I'm hearing these concerns from farmers. They're very distraught because they're trying to do a good job. They're trying to take care of us, and they feel like they're being penalized by the government for doing so.
Your leader, Pierre Poilievre, has blasted the Trudeau Liberals as well in the House of Commons about tripling the carbon tax. How do you think this will really impact the average Canadian household as well, especially as the mercury plummets and we roll into the colder winter months?
Mm-hmm. It's certainly a big concern for me. I've had numerous people come into my office with their home heating bills, and they'll often circle the carbon tax line so that I can see directly what it equates to for them, and they're just totally distraught. And for good reason. Again, the Trudeau Liberals have determined that they are going to triple the carbon tax. Well, at the end of the day, we know people need to heat their homes. This is Canada. And so putting a carbon tax on that is just punitive in nature. It's not actually going to help curb behavior. So the Canadians are seeing that. I guess I would just say this. Over the last year, people have watched their home heating bills double. And we are being told that we can expect home heating to come up by another 30 to 50% this winter. We know Canadians are already having a really hard time making ends meet, putting food on their table, paying their rent, getting their kids to sports. Watching their heating bill increase by another $100 a month, it's too much. And so people are certainly speaking out and expressing a great deal of concern.
Now, you are the CPC's Shadow Minister for Canadian Heritage, and you're bringing forward a motion calling for the Minister of Heritage, Pablo Rodriguez, to appear before a committee to answer questions regarding a large sum of money that was given to someone who was an alleged anti-Semite. Can you explain?
Yeah. So Mr. Maroof is the individual we're referring to, and he was given about $133,000 in government contracts from the Heritage Department in order to run anti-racism training. That's what it was called. This is interesting because we see a myriad of tweets and other social media posts that are incredibly derogatory in nature. They are extremely vile. I mean, this individual went so far as to call Jews human bags of feces. Those are his words. Those are his exact words used on Twitter. And the truth is, the sad truth is that that's actually only the tip of the iceberg. The vile nature of this individual's comments are it's hard to even fathom. And so to see that the government actually contracted this individual to the tune of $133,000 to run an anti-racism program is just wow. And so, anyways, all that to say, that information came to light in the department in mid-July. And it took a month and a half for the Heritage Minister, Minister Rodriguez, to finally make a statement about it. And for myself and for so many Canadians, especially those that are part of the Jewish community, that is just reprehensible. Like it is just it's atrocious that the minister would take a month and a half to finally come out with a statement, let alone take action. And so, I think at the end of the day, Canadians deserve better. Canadians want better. And so now they're calling for transparency. They're calling for accountability. They want to know how this happened. They want to know what the government's going to do differently going forward. And I think they're frustrated with the minister and his overall inaction on this issue. So at Heritage Committee, it's our responsibility to hold the minister to account. And so we've asked for him to come and testify. Unfortunately, our motions that we have moved have been shut down. For some reason, the Liberals and the NDP and the Bloc seem to want to protect the minister and keep him from having to answer important questions. But we're going to keep trying because that's our job. Our job as opposition is to hold the government to account and to bring forward the initiatives that are required to do so.
Now, Rachel, you've also attacked the Liberals on Bill C-18, which you say will proliferate fake news, misinformation, and promote clickbait. Now, you asked Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez to make amendments to the bill. What did he have to say?
Yeah, Bill C-18 is just a terrible piece of legislation that will destroy the internet the way that we know it. And so one of the things that this bill does is it forces Google and Facebook as platforms to enter into negotiations with any news outlet that has 2 full-time journalists so that they can be compensated for the news that is being shared. The problem with this, Hal, is that there are no other criteria that are established. It's just simply 2 full-time journalists. And so it's left incredibly gray. So what constitutes news? What counts, what doesn't? So essentially, if the bill is left the way that it is, really it forces Google and Facebook's hands to have to negotiate, which means that they could be in a place where they are forced to proliferate news that is fake or disinformation or just altogether reprehensible. And so I think that's dangerous. I think that's extremely dangerous. And if this bill truly is about making sure that Canadians have access to choice in the media and making sure they have access to a variety of viewpoints, making sure they have access to good journalism, then, perhaps the government should invest some time and energy into making sure that there are amendments made to this bill to ensure that it actually does do those things they're claiming to do.
Ottawa brought forth their legislation putting a freeze on handguns. They say it will really curtail gun violence and keep our streets safer in Canada. But let me ask you something. How do you see it?
Well, interestingly enough, despite all of their efforts, despite all of the firearms legislation that has been put in place by this government, since the Liberals took the helm in 2015, gun violence has skyrocketed. It has dramatically increased in this country. That should be very telling. For me, and for many experts who are looking at this, this is the conclusion. The conclusion is that this government is more interested in going after individuals who own their firearms legally, use their firearms legally, abide by the law, keep the peace. They're responsible citizens. Those are the people that the government is choosing to go after. Well, we know that's not going to make a difference. It's just going to make their lives difficult. But meanwhile, gangs and illegal trafficking of firearms, those are 2 problems that are not being tackled by this government. And so those problems will continue to perpetuate. And that's exactly what we're seeing because we're watching as crime is going through the roof. Now, what I find interesting is that while this government is putting a freeze on handguns, they are simultaneously moving Bill C-5. Bill C-5 actually rewards criminals. It actually takes away minimum sentences for those that would commit a crime using a firearm. So I find it interesting that on one hand they're wanting to freeze handgun purchases, but on the other hand they're actually wanting to let criminals off the hook if they commit a crime using a firearm. Again, it's just so hard to fathom, and it's incredibly destructive to our country, to our democracy, to our people, to our confidence in the government and in the justice system. It's just wrong, because really what the Liberals are doing is they're playing politics. They're trying to pretend that they're doing something that they're not. Our communities are not safer because of their legislation.
The public inquiry into the Emergencies Act continues in Ottawa. A number of city officials have already testified, and there's been a lot of finger pointing so far. Now, how do you see it, Rachel? Was the federal government correct in invoking the act last February during the Freedom Convoy?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, at the end of the day, there's a very high bar that is set in order for the Emergencies Act to be justified. And what that means is that it's reserved for the most serious circumstances, where regular legal powers would not be able to resolve the issue at hand. And so ultimately now, with the public inquiry, it is going to be determined through this process as to whether or not that high bar was really met. So, I'm going to watch that unfold, but I would say that based on my observations, these were law-abiding citizens who were, protesting on Parliament Hill, wanting to make their voices heard. Certainly, they felt ignored, they felt silenced, they felt scapegoated. Yes, there was some discomfort around it for folks, but really, this is not a question about discomfort. This is a question about whether or not other legal means could have been used to resolve this issue. That's going to be up to this commission to decide, and I'm going to be watching closely. And I would encourage Canadians to do the same, because ultimately, whatever the outcome, we do need to hold the government to account.
And these concerned Canadians who protested during the Freedom Convoy were also not funded by the Russians, like some other media outlets reported early on in the campaign. A number of Conservatives are quite concerned with the coalition formed by the Liberals and the NDP. The NDP is an opposition party and should be acting like one instead of being part of this coalition until the year 2025. Now, you say this coalition is not working in the best interest of Canadians. How so?
It's based on this basic premise, Hal. Democracy works when there is a governing party and opposing parties. That is how Canada is set up. So when one of those opposing parties chooses to not fulfill its role, it is actually thwarting democracy. So the NDP going on side with the Liberals and making a determination to keep the Liberals in power is actually really sad for Canadians, because Canadians deserve transparency. They deserve accountability. They deserve a strong democratic system. And so it is disappointing to watch it play out. And I certainly don't believe that it's in the best interest of Canadians. And that's something that I'm hearing from many folks who are taking the time to write into my office or phone me, meet with me. They're very concerned with regards to the state of our democracy, where we're at, and the lack of accountability for the current government.
Now, Rachel, you have seen firsthand, because this is your home riding as well in Lethbridge, we still have serious drug, crime, and homeless issues in our city, especially with the tent encampments. The police have been tearing some of them down, but again, where are homeless going to go, right? Now, you as our MP, how are you working with our MLAs and Mayor Blaine Hagan to really address these very serious concerns in our city?
Mm-hmm. A really good question, Hal. And this is a problem that we've faced for quite some time in our community, and we've tried various ways of addressing it. I would say that right now, I'm watching as the situation is being exacerbated. One of the factors that is exacerbating it is actually the cost of living and affordability. Just in the last few months, I've had two different folks come into my office and share with me that one individual had to give up their place because they couldn't afford rent and now live in their car. Another couple came into my office and said they couldn't make their mortgage payments, and so they actually went to insolvency and then now live in a small RV. These are real stories. These are people in our community, and these folks went from having a home to now not having a home. If that continues, we will watch as homelessness continues to rise as well. That concerns me. But there are also the issues of mental health and addiction, and all of this needs to be addressed. And so one of the ways we can do that is by working together with all three levels of government and community partners. And so there has been a roundtable established, and we're meeting to talk about this issue and to figure out the next steps ahead. But I think there's also an important point to make, if I may just take a second, and that is this. Oftentimes, the good initiatives that are taking place are overshadowed by the growing problem. And I do recognize that the problem needs to be addressed. But I also just want to give a little bit of a shout out to the incredible not-for-profit organizations and charities and churches that are doing remarkable work in our community to try to get at this issue and make a meaningful difference in people's lives. Because I do believe they need to be celebrated and known for the good work that they're doing. Even though we do see that the problem does need far more attention.
Yeah, some of the nonprofits, including Streets Alive, and as well the Lethbridge Soup Kitchen with Bill Ginther, they do incredible work here. Lethbridge MP and Shadow Minister for Canadian Heritage, Rachel Thomas, thanks so much for joining us today from Ottawa.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Alberta Health Services is one of the best funded in Canada, yet has what many believe are mediocre results. From the public side, Albertans deal with long wait times and perceived inefficiencies. Administrators deal with staffing shortages and an unsatisfied public. But is there a win-win solution for Albertans and their healthcare provider? Well, to discuss this in further detail, we are pleased to have Stephen Lewis, a health policy and research consultant and adjunct professor of health policy at Simon Fraser University. Stephen, welcome to Bridge City News. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So there is so much conversation and opinion in Alberta right now about healthcare. Most recently, I guess our new Premier, Danielle Smith, has canceled a health agreement with the World Economic Forum, saying that she doesn't want to have any ties with a group that brags about controlling governments and politicians. But if the agreement were to go through, the province would supposedly share ideas with health researchers at Mayo Clinic and Harvard University. So, Stephen, do you have an opinion on this? Is she making a good decision by keeping things more Alberta-centric, so to speak, or is she going about this the wrong way?
Well, I think she's gotten out of the gate with some pretty provocative statements. And I think the World Economic Forum thing, which is information sharing, is basically a distraction. It's a red herring. Health systems learn from each other around the world every day from multiple sources, from medical literature, from colleagues around the world. So I don't think it's central one way or the other whether they cancel this, because the same kind of people who would also be part of that forum, they can talk to them anytime they want, 1,000 times a day. So yeah, I don't think that's it. I think more centrally is her stated plans to fire the AHS board, appoint a commissioner. She's blamed the board publicly for almost a conspiracy to understate the staff shortages and so on. I mean, if you want the health system to improve, it seems to be reasonable to have good working relationships and have a trusting relationship with your by far biggest supplier of healthcare, which is AHS. So I think the previous premier at the beginning of his tenure also kind of declared war on doctors a little bit, and paid a pretty steep price for that in terms of trust and ability to get things done. So I don't see any early signs that she's intending to repair that anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. So in your opinion, not exactly the best place for her to be starting with firing the AHS board.
Well, I think to say if we get a new board or we replace it with a commissioner and a one-person commissioner at the beginning, that's going to solve all the problems in healthcare or even begin to solve them is illusory. I mean, Alberta has problems. So does every province. Every province had them before the pandemic, but they are now made much worse by the pandemic. So every province has an enormous surgical backlog. Every province is struggling with primary care. and getting it right, which everyone has aspired to for decades but hasn't managed to achieve. I think there is an appetite for change, and there's a need for change because with the pandemic and with all these unmet needs, we can't just wait this out. The system has to be more agile. It has to figure out ways to create surge capacity when you need it. It also doesn't help if you have a government that seems not to believe much in public health anymore, and certainly a premier who has said some pretty dramatically radical things about what you can and can't do to control pandemics and so on. So you have a bit of a perfect storm here, and I think while Alberta is not unique in its problems, it may be unique in the potential for conflict and chaos in the next couple of years, unless the tune changes quite a bit.
And of course, some in positions of authority say that the current public health care situation comes down to scarcity of services and funding. And of course, scarcity in economics refers to when the demand for a resource is greater than the supply of that resource, as resources are limited. So in your opinion, do you think the scarcity argument is appropriate, or is there another way to look at healthcare delivery and outcomes?
Well, I mean, we've had a history of this, right? I mean, we have tried to buy our way out and increase supply our way out of health problems historically. From about 1997 to 2010, the country doubled its healthcare spending. And did it get rid of wait lists? No. Did it make sure that everybody had a family doctor? No. So, and then you look on the other side of the ledger, there's a lot of research in health that shows somewhere between 15 and 30% of healthcare is either no value added, and some of it's even harmful, like excess prescribing of drugs to the elderly, which results in a whole lot of people ending up in hospital due to over medication and so forth. So it's not always a supply problem, but the reality is right now, we are not meeting needs. So either we have to use the personnel and the resources we have differently, make a real concerted effort to get rid of the low value care so we can concentrate on the higher value care, and get better at the things we've never been particularly good at, which is prevention. So if you have a fairly weak or incomplete primary care system, if you have 600,000 or 700,000 Albertans without a regular source of care, a whole lot of people will end up in the hospital because their conditions got worse when they didn't have to. It's a complicated problem, and you won't solve it in a week and you won't solve it in 2 years, but you do have to chart a new course that gives you some shot at solving it in the long run. I don't believe the solution is just to dump more money into this system, because if you dump more money into the same system, you're going to get the same results. I mean, we have way more doctors than we ever have before per capita in this country, way more than we did 20 years ago, and still there's an access problem. So simple numerical problems and simple saying, oh, if we only could spend another couple of $1 billion, we will solve this. It didn't happen before, and it's not going to happen now.
So from your research, do you think that that's probably the best way that Alberta Health Services can provide better levels of service with a smaller budget, or what would be your opinion?
I don't think you should be cutting spending at this point. And one of the reasons why Alberta spends so much is not because it has more service, it's because it pays better. I mean, Alberta has historically been a rich province, and wages and salaries are higher there. So it's going to cost you more per unit, and that's why the per capita costs in Alberta are so high. I don't think there is any hard evidence to suggest that Alberta is notably more inefficient once you account for that than any other province. And it's really hard to have a blanket overall grade for a healthcare system. I'm not saying there aren't serious problems in Alberta, but those problems aren't unique to Alberta. And Alberta has a lot of strengths. I mean, you have very, very good clinicians, especially the academic centers, and the relationships with their zones and with the province in general is pretty strong. You have strategic clinical networks that try to improve the quality of care. So there's a lot of talent and a lot of infrastructure here. But there's also a lot of rural infrastructure here, and there's a lot of promises being made that, you can't touch anything in rural healthcare. Well, some rural healthcare is by definition more expensive because you don't have economies of scale. And if people say, we voted for you so we wouldn't have to go to the next town to go to a hospital, or we want you to try to recruit specialists to our small area, those are kind of very difficult things to do, and they're costly things to do. But that's a political decision. It has nothing to do with AHS. I mean, AHS is be constrained in how much it can move around resources. If AHS said, all things considered, we can meet the needs in this region with 2 hospitals instead of 4, there's no way they're going to be allowed to do that. So don't point the finger at AHS as being the source of this kind of inefficiency. It's built into the political dynamic of the province.
Where do you think the problem started? How far back do you think it went?
Well, the problems, again, aren't unique in Alberta. I think they've started because we've never really had the kind of unified approach between medical associations and governments about how are we going to fix these things together? What do we agree that we all ought to do together? I think Alberta, one of Alberta's historical problems in a way has been that it's been so rich. I mean, in all those years where Alberta had enormous resources, it built a lot of infrastructure. And again, it was easier to add more money and to buy more equipment and open up another fancy 75-bed hospital in a smaller center than to actually get down to the work of saying, look, let's try to get the waste out of the system. Let's really focus on primary care. And on that score, remember, AHS is not responsible for primary care. So the talk about Alberta having a unified healthcare system that's all one big family doing everything, actually leaving primary care out of AHS, makes it a lot harder to integrate primary care with the rest of the system and operate it like it is a system instead of a bunch of autonomous physicians, thousands of them making their own decisions about where to practice, whether they're going to take new patients, and so on. Now, you have the primary care networks that were supposed to do some of this, but it's pretty lightly organized compared to the rest of the system. So again, I'm sorry to make these answers too complicated, but the system is complicated. And there are multiple causes. And if you don't address all of the pieces of the puzzle, you're going to have a tough time making any kind of durable improvements.
Okay, so Stephen, we've heard that the Arrive Can app costs Canadians $55 million. So the reason I mention this is because it was reported to us by an Alberta doctor that the healthcare software purchased by AHS allegedly cost over $1 billion. Have you looked into this software in your policy work at all?
Well, every IT project in every industry, including healthcare, always ends up costing way more than you thought at the beginning. It just seems to be kind of a built-in virus to this whole enterprise. And there are, some of it sounds absurd for sure, but some of it that sounds crazy, you realize, well, they start out and they think they're going to get this, and then you say, well, we have 3 other things you want to add in here, and then we want to expand it here. I'm not saying that there's great value for money in this. I don't know. I'm not an IT expert. But I think what the system needs is, okay, if I were in charge of procuring IT for healthcare, the first people I would hire are people who used to work in that industry and know it inside out from the costing and so forth, and say, you tell us whether we're paying too much for this. But the reality is, every system in the world, every healthcare system in the world pays a lot of money. It seems to be a crazy amount of money to get the IT right. It's just the cost of doing business. And if you don't do it, if you don't create an integrated health record, if you don't have the flow of information, you get all sorts of redundant testing and people still using fax machines and people not having a single health record so that if you're from Grand Prairie and you get sick in Calgary, they know what your record is. It sounds, we all think, why is it so expensive? The reality is it just is. And do it well, and learn from your mistakes in the past, but there's no free lunch here, alas.
Right. Just one of those unfortunate facts of life, I guess.
That's right.
Really quickly, you've been sort of championing Alberta Health Services and sticking up for them. What would your advice be to Danielle Smith for her next step with Alberta Healthcare?
Well, to be bluntly honest, I was agnostic from the beginning about Alberta Health Services. I didn't see any reason why you should get rid of regions in Alberta. But now you have Alberta Health Services. And what we do know is restructuring one way or another, regionalizing, deregionalizing, that none of that solves your problem. Your problem isn't primarily structure. Any structure can work and any structure can fail. So you have this, it's well developed, people know what it is. It's had, 12 years, 13 years to find its feet, to figure things out, to figure out its relationship with the zones. My advice would be, don't mess with the structure that you have. It's not worth it, and it will not solve your problems. It will take 3 to 5 years to adjust to a new structure. The second thing I would say is you have to establish relationships of trust. I mean, if everybody in Alberta Health Services, especially at senior levels, is on pins and needles because you never know what's coming next, and is the government going to swoop in and abort some plan that you've been working on for 3 years that has a potential to do good? It's kind of stay in your lane. You have a right as a government to set policy. You have a right to act on your values. You have a right to set broad priorities, but let Alberta Health Services do its job. Sure, hold it accountable, but make that accountability transparent. You better say to Alberta Health Services, this is what we mean by performance. This is what we're going to judge you on. And then if it falls short, you've got two approaches. One is we're going to behead people and we're going to fire them, the lot of you, and we're going to do this and that and micromanage it. Or the other one is let's do quality improvement, learn from our mistakes, figure out how to get better, have constant discussions, and we'll get through this together. I mean, you're either a unified province where the government, the Minister of Health, the Department of Health, and Alberta Health Services are colleagues, and they work on this together, and it's not us and them, or they're not. And it seems to me the only way forward here that's going to work is if it is a much more trusting, respectful, and a relationship with good communication between people, and that the last thing you should be doing is yanking AHS here and there, firing the board, figuring we'll get a new CEO and that'll fix everything. That's just pie in the sky.
Stephen, we are out of time, but we sure do appreciate your insights and conversation. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. That was Stephen Lewis, a health policy and research consultant and adjunct professor for health policy at Simon Fraser University. Mr. Lewis joined us from his office in Vancouver today. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.